Reen and Gilgamesh are not all we'll get. It's pretty safe to expect at this point that Fate will be a yearly event, which begs the question, who are we going to get? Who are the options, what criteria might Hoyo have for picking them, and what order might we get them? With Gil and Reen's kits, we now know they're going to try and make the characters all work together. It wasn't really a surprise Reen is supportive, but Gil being made for Saber is unexpected and changes how we should think of future releases. Another major factor though, as I discussed in my previous video, is that they're always going to want to have a female character and not just release two guys, which poses a slight problem. There are less popular female characters left from Unlimited Blade Works than male ones. For the guys, we have Lancer, Shiro, Kirei, two assassins, not you, and Hercules. While for the girls, we have Ryder, okay, extremely safe bet, but then Sakura, who takes us completely out of Unlimited Blade Works and will have to pretty heavily spoil Heaven's Feel, but you know, it's doable. She is the third main heroine, and the visual novel has been out for more than 20 years at this point, and really, the spoilers aren't that bad. We Fate fans have a tendency to exaggerate the potential impact of spoilers, when, in reality, all the things most likely to actually spoil your experience are the things that are already common knowledge that will make the start of the original visual novel feel slow, and so affect anime-only viewers way less. So she's risky, but also pretty much a shoo-in. But then, who do we have left? Media? I'd love to see her, but she's not popular in Japan, and even more than that, her voice actress actually passed away, and it feels hard to imagine that Star Rail is the thing that actually casts the next VA for her, because, yeah, she hasn't featured in anything or gotten any new voice lines since. It's felt like they've kind of decided to just retire the character to avoid recasting her out of respect, and because they weren't doing much with her anyway. There's also Saber Alter though, who they could certainly release if they need to or want to, if they are allowed to release characters from other routes besides just Unlimited Blade Works. It's just a bit hard to think how they would make her different enough from regular Saber to really make it exciting. I guess, at least in terms of design, for regular Saber they went with just her dress and more unarmoured look, while Saber Alter could come in the full armour that she usually wears, but kit-wise, it's much harder to think how they would be that different. Again, at least enough to make it exciting that she's being released. And then, lastly, I guess, Illya? But lollies, thankfully, don't really sell very well, and she herself doesn't really do anything unless they suddenly swerve into the Prisma version of her, where she's a whole-ass magical girl in a world without the Holy Grail War, which seems unlikely. So it's hard to imagine her holding up the banners all by herself for the waifu players. They could really surprise us, I guess, by releasing Taiga. That would be awesome, to be honest, but she really doesn't have any flashy abilities for her kit. They would have to make her basically a gag character. But I think it's worth mentioning and considering because they could do that. The game even now has a path exactly for that. And most of all, she could solve another problem for them because she could actually fit well as a sustain. Since they seem to be making full teams out of the Fate characters, they should need dedicated sustains at some point. But the issue with that is that no one really straightforwardly fits as one. There aren't any characters that you can look at and just be like, oh yeah, they'll be a sustain for sure. Especially because they seem to have a hard time selling sustains. They barely make any anymore, and when they do, they make them utterly mandatory. And it makes sense. Sustains aren't sexy. They're not doing a load of damage or giving insane buffs. They're just a necessity, a box that we often have to check. There's a few ways they can deal with that for Fate though. First of all is the one that's really hard to talk about, which is that they could just abandon the Unlimited Blade Works branding entirely and release anyone from the whole franchise that would be really easy to sell as a sustain, but that opens the door to over 500 potential releases. As much as I'd like to, it's just too much to talk about with not enough to go on. But I think there is a decent chance that instead of expanding into the larger franchise, they could actually just get a bit more original. I could see a new alternate version of Saber as a healer, for example, with Avalon and everything, since every character so far has already been a slightly original take on them with a new design made by Hoyo, and Star Rail does like doing SPs. Otherwise, they could just force one of the most popular characters into being a sustain and shill the shit out of them, but risk disappointing existing fans of the character. Given how Gilgamesh is looking, that might not bother them though. Or they could surprise us by releasing a more minor character as a sustain and just accept that they won't sell that well. Perhaps by making them free, and make Taiga an even bigger surprise if she's the first free female. They could even make the gender balance work too, by releasing Illya alongside her with Hercules. It would be really similar to Clara, but I don't think they care for a few reasons. To start with, she's a standard banner character from 1.0. By the time we could possibly get Illya, Clara will be even more irrelevant. And with the reveal of Gilgamesh, they've shown they don't really care about overlap, because they went with a design for him just like Mides, rather than putting him in his armour. Which, by the way, the absolute cowards! Give me full, blindingly gold Gilgamesh. I don't care if solid armour is harder for you to animate, and super deep, shiny gold could maybe clash with the art style. Gimme it! Anyway, I digress. They could still heavily differentiate Illya in gameplay too. I mean, unlike Svarog, Herc is a berserker. He's not just going to sit around and wait to be hit. They could even make Illya Remembrance too, and take advantage of releasing two characters together to finally release an actual master that summons their servant. Then, otherwise, that list of guys can be pared down a bit if there's too many of them compared to the girls as well. The two assassins are great, and I really like them, but they don't really get a lot of screen time, and haven't had a lot done with them since. Just like Media, they've never gotten a 5-star version in FGO, for example. Heck, they've never gotten any kind of alternate version. Even Media has at least had one variant of herself released. Then Kiri is pretty huge. It's hard to say he's not popular or anything, but compared to the others, it doesn't feel weird for him to get passed over and left out or anything, leaving you with a potentially even split. While I don't think these would be the combinations, they could do Sakura and Shiro, Ryder and Lancer, Salter and the Illya and Herc combo that could basically serve as a free space to fix the gender imbalance whenever they need to, and Taiga and Kiri, I guess, sure, yeah. The problem with doing someone like Taiga though is that it would be pretty hard to justify not doing the other servants too if you're doing Taiga, but then you could just do something like Media and Kojiro as well, meaning I think only Cursed Arm would be left out. And if you really wanted to get him in too, you could just separate Illya and Herc and make Illya his release partner. So, having said all that, who do I actually think might release next? It's actually really hard to guess at, mostly thanks to Shiro, and the major unknown of how many collabs and teams we will actually get. I've written like a million different versions of the script for this part, but I think I've got some good guesses now. 2 sets of them even. And regardless, going through the kinds of things Hoyo will have to consider can hopefully help you come up with your own predictions. teams. For the guy slot next year, I'd say it's between Lancer and Shiro, since they're the most popular. Based on how it's gone so far, it seems like they want to keep edging us with Lancer as a hint that more characters are on the way. The problem with that, though, is I'm not sure they can release Shiro this early, because where does he go? With Saber and Gil, or Archer and Reen? Thematically, I'd kind of like him to be made to go with Archer and Reen, because I think it'd be really funny if they made Archer occasionally deal damage to him. But the problem is, does he replace Sparkle? Whereas the Saber team still has a free slot for a generic buffer, and he can just fight with Gilgamesh instead. But it doesn't feel right for him to not be able to fit in with Archer and Reen, and that's the same with Saber, or something like a potential future Sakura and Ryder team. Making him dedicated to only one team could actually really ruffle some feathers too. It feels almost like choosing a canon ending to the original visual novel. So he'd really make sense as a more complicated Cyrene that could work with all of the Fate units in different ways. The problem with releasing him so soon as a Fate Cyrene, though, is if they release enough characters to form a third team, he would need to be updated down the road to work with them. Unless they release Shiro and Ryder together. I don't think they'd want to release Shiro and Sakura together anyway, since they're both humans who can be a bit of a surprise that they're actually being made, and potentially create a small buzz on social media as a result, while releasing him with Ryder could let her be the start of a new third team that Shiro can be made to work with from the beginning. That would also mean that the new third team isn't having to start with only one unit that just has to use 3 generic supports, while letting them still release support for our existing Fate teams. So you get and want Shiro because he supports your Saber and or Archer, and then you feel more tempted by Ryder since he can also work with her with just another couple of generic supports in the meantime. With modern kit design though, she doesn't even necessarily have to go on her own team from the beginning either. While I think Hoyo will ultimately be designing dedicated teams, in reality things will probably be a lot more fluid than that now that we're in the era of characters just doing everything. She can be like Ashvale and Blade and fit excellently on other existing teams, while still clearly having a completely different role with her dedicated team in the future. And I do think they're going to make a third team, because if they want to release Sakura, the third main heroine of Fate Stay Night, they're going to need to. There's not really enough room on the existing teams for everyone anyway, and so far we do have the main heroines on different teams, and it would probably make sense to keep that up so as to not overload only one team with multiple of the main heroines. Them making a third team is probably the biggest assumption that I've had to make, because I just think it works out the best. Sparkle doesn't have to be kicked off of Archer's team. It means they can spread the characters out and avoid overloading one team, like I said. Someone would have to be left out otherwise, most likely Illya, Herc or Sakura. There are 3 routes in the original visual novel, and there's design space left for a third team. So far, the Fate teams both focus on one of the fundamental mechanics, one of the basic buttons. Archer is skill damage, Saber is ult damage, so why not have a team built around basic attacks? It's also just more interesting to talk about. If they don't make a third team, it's just something like Shiro and Ryder and then Illya and Lancer, and I have no idea who goes on what team or who can be the sustains. Whereas with a third team, they can avoid making multiple sustains since they seem to hate it. With Shiro. Yeah, rather than just a Fate Cyrene, he could be a Fate Cyrene Sustain. It makes sense with his self-sacrificing and heroic ideals of saving everyone for him to be a Sustain, so maybe why not? The only problem would be that you can only have one team at full power at a time then, but for Hoyo, that might be a benefit, if anything. It encourages engaging with the rest of the game and Hoyo's more profitable original characters instead of just relying entirely on only Fate characters. And it's also not at all unprecedented since Columbina did basically the same thing in Genshin. If they do go down this kind of route with Shiro though, they better go all out and really blow the budget. Like on Archer's team, maybe he uses Ro Eas to shield, and finally gives him the territory he should have had all along. For Saber, he heals with Avalon and by supplying her with mana. With Sakura, he has the arm. Or hell, they'd never do it, but imagine if when paired with Illya, he became Miuverse Shiro. There's so much they could do. The problem that still leaves us though is that with 3 teams and only 2 releases per year, that means one isn't getting any new dedicated support each year. But I think that might actually work and be okay thanks to Sparkle. If every team gets a new dedicated support every year, then it doesn't take very long at all for Sparkle to be kicked out of the team, which isn't ideal. Maybe it is the plan eventually, but the longer it's put off, the better. That might be the big issue with releasing Shiro next year as a general sustain though, because the only free slot left on Archer's team is the sustain. So if that's Shiro, that kind of gives the Archer team no room for future upgrades at all without replacing Sparkle, which I'm trying to avoid predicting. I could see Hoyo being fine with not giving him any supports though, since he was free anyway and he's had a great run and might just keep getting buffed by general mechanics anyway. But if they just release Shiro later, then they could spread out their support. For the reasons I gave earlier though, I still think Shiro would be next. They could always Nova Flare Archer if they have to even, and maybe the fact that he will be a free option every year, they will consider enough support for Archer mains. So, after Shiro and Ryder, I'd guess at Sakura to properly form that third team. But the male slot is a lot harder to say. Lancer is really hard to place, as he could go on just about any of the teams really, because he should probably be his own main DPS, but it's really hard to imagine how that would be possible, and you could have said the same for Gil before too. I think they would still want to keep him in their back pocket though, because he's the most popular character left at that point. If they don't hold on to him, they don't really have any big hitters left to really make people expect another collab. No, instead, I think they might actually release Illya here, taking advantage of the fact that they could release her as a 2-for-1 with Hercules to fill the male slot. The only problem with that though is I really don't know what team they could go on. They could even make sense as a sustain with Herc tanking and Illya providing mana. Finally, I think after that would be Lancer and Saber Alter. HSR does do alternate versions after all, so why not one of the most famous of all? She could go on a team with regular Saber of course, but I bet they wouldn't miss the chance to try and make Saber fans commit to a whole nother team by putting her with Sakura and Ryder for a Heavensfeel team. While Lancer could maybe actually be a speed support and go on Saber's team instead, since both Gil and Saber like to take as many turns as possible. Who knows though, the further away things get, the more impossible it is to actually predict, since even if you guess the current plan perfectly, it can change. Still though, I think maybe Shiro and Ryder, Sakura and Illya Herc, and Lancer and Salter. And then, fuck it, after that they can release Kirei and Elation SP support Sustain Taiga, who can finally replace Sparkle and also be Legacy support for Spark Z at the same time. Why not? Just fully embrace Elation at that point. Ultimately, I'm not sure. The only ones that I've really kept consistent throughout all of these iterations of the script are Ryder and Sakura, since I don't think they'd release Sakura before Ryder or any of the other characters that could go on her team. But even then, maybe she could be the Ash Veil, who knows? While the male side could all move and swap about, with Illya in particular being a wild card. For example, maybe if Ryder is a team supporting DPS like Ash Veil, maybe she doesn't need Shiro's support to help begin a third team. And Lancer could release next year instead, with Shiro then releasing the year after that, better spreading out the support for Archer and Reen, while Salter instead of Sakura goes on Ryder's team and helps solidify that third team without having to release Shiro and Sakura together, and instead making Sakura and Herc the big hitters that we know we're going to be getting another collab to get, since they're too big to be left out at that point and can be big enough deals to really support and make it hype enough to be potentially the final collab. I could rewrite the whole script again around that version of events, but it still has its problems, like that last collab potentially not releasing any characters for Saber and Archer's teams, and just finishing off that third team that we don't even have yet. As well as the fact that, based on the order of releases so far and the popularity of characters, I do just feel like Shiro is next. Or it could be entirely different again. If I try and put my bias aside and stop worrying about replacing Sparkle, then instead of a total of 5 collabs, we could get 6, for a total of 12 characters to make up 3 full teams. And everything could be completely different. That has the problem that one of the collabs would have to be a lot less hype though, and requires releasing less popular characters, as well as picking one true dedicated team for Shiro, which I guess would have to be Archer, because of their connection and the Unlimited Blade Works branding, which is Shiro's route more than anyone else's really. And as well as that, they would have to make 3 separate sustains, one of which would really have to be a girl, and so likely not the free character either. All my predictions have also assumed that they're not restricted to Unlimited Blade Works specifically either, since there have already been inconsistencies and it would massively limit the characters that could be released. There's no Sakura, Saber Alter, or even Ryder really, if they're adhering strictly to Unlimited Blade Works. If they are limited to only that route, then it would have to be something like Shiro and Media, and Lancer, with Illya having to hold up the banner for the waifu players, with very little room for further collabs. They could release Ryder still instead, since she is in the route, but she really doesn't do anything, it's just not her route. So I felt it a lot more worthwhile to assume that they will be allowed to use things from Heaven's Field. I mean, they've been able to use even Ishtar from FGO for Reen. They really don't seem to be restricted, and Type Moon don't often like to stand in the way of an artist's good ideas. But regardless of how difficult it is to actually predict the future, hopefully this was all still helpful and interesting. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and check out my other videos, since, just like my last few, I don't really expect this one to do very well. Until hopefully next time, bye.